Welcome to the Summer of Bonhoeffer. This is my seminary life, and I am your host, Brandon Knight, and we are here today to kick off the new summer series, the Summer of Bonhoeffer, where every week throughout the next 3 months, we're going to be looking at the different writings, lectures, sermons, what have you, on or written by the famous Lutheran German theologian from the 1930s and 40s, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And to get started on a series about a Lutheran, I thought it made sense to bring a Lutheran along. So here he is, friend of the show, friend of mine in general, Pastor Will Rose of Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in Chapel Hill. Pastor Will, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Yeah, your favorite Lutheran pastor named Will. I'll take.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know if you have any other Lutheran pastor friends named Will, but I'll claim like your favorite one named Will.
That is for sure.
And
yeah,
you
I don't
hung
have any
out.
other Lutheran friends.
You actually, we hung out in person not that long ago, and you actually came to Holy Trinity Lutheran Church and hung out and slept here. And I took you to some favorite restaurants. We grilled out at my house. You met my dog. Yeah. That was good times. So
I was really interested. Not that I didn't believe you, but I was really interested to know, because you always say we're on the doorstep of the University of North Carolina. And the whole time I'm thinking, okay, that's not a real distance of measurement. What is the doorstep? And you're not kidding. Like, in my head, I'm picturing like a road, like you're going to go down the block, down a couple blocks, and then there's the university. Like, no, you're surrounded by frat houses and sorority houses. Like, it was a minute walk. That was, that is the doorstep.
And you're at the on Franklin Street with great, restaurants and hangouts and all that stuff. So I got to take you to some of my favorite places on campus around. We tried to get you to the Dean Dome to see like where they play basketball, but they were having like graduations and stuff. So they blocked us with a literal roadblock.
A literal roadblock. We did not see that one coming, but maybe I'll be out there again. It was a good time. There was a few things I didn't get to do that I will definitely look forward to coming back. And, that couch in the youth group room, that's pretty comfy. It was, it worked.
Sure is.
There's
been some afternoons when I hit the wall and I'm like, I need to do a little reading. I'll go upstairs, lay on the couch, and I get like one paragraph in, and then I wake up 45 minutes later. Oh boy, okay, time to get going.
It's what you really needed,
Yeah, Sabbath.
Anyway, so starting out today, we're not going to be spending time looking at any one of Bonhoeffer's writings in particular. We might touch on several just briefly, but we're not here to analyze any of his writings in depth today. Instead, Pastor Will, I want us to answer the question, why? Why bother? Why does this guy's work matter? Because Bonhoeffer has been a very influential theologian for decades now, but it really does seem like within the past 10 years or so, there's been this resurgence of interest in Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Now, you're a Lutheran. He's one of your guys. So this is why I think you're like one of the best people to have this conversation with. So let's just start out there with, why do you think Bonhoeffer is so popular again? What do you have any theories as to why people are really into his work right now?
Yeah, I think like the questions that he raises are timeless in terms of like the main question: how does if we take our faith seriously, if we take following Jesus seriously, if we take discipleship, that is being a disciple of Jesus seriously, then what shape does that take in the world? What does that look like? And so as we're confronted with challenges in life transitions, but also with our own sin and brokenness, the sin and brokenness of systems and structures and governments and war, we bump up. That's an ageless question: is what does it look like to follow Jesus? What kind of shape does Christ take in the world? And then we as his body, as the church, what shape does the church take in the world in terms of living our lives as the body of Christ in the world? So those are the timeless questions. So we'll reference Dr. Jeffrey Pugh later on in his book. But he lifted up this kind of understanding that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was just an ordinary guy from an educated family who wanted to study academia and theology, but he was thrust into an extraordinary time and probably worst times in world history in terms of World War II and one of the worst regimes that humanity could ever produce. And he was kind of thrust in there, and with those particular questions, really lifted to the surface a role model of not only how to articulate how to follow Jesus, but also in how he lived his life, literally being martyred for his faith and his resistance against Hitler and nationalism and those things. So, and injustice. So I think that's why. And then, we in our scriptures, we have St. Paul, who wrote letters from a prison. And some timeless Christology and how to be the church and how to follow Jesus. Well, here is Bonhoeffer was also thrown into prison. And there he was sitting alone with his thoughts and thought through, what does that look like? And how am I a Christian? How do I follow Christ? And so his writings from prison endured and what he wrote there. And then, similar to Martin Luther King Jr., who from a letter from a Birmingham jail sat with his thoughts and wrote a timeless letter to the church. And what does it mean to be the church in the world? So I think those themes are there.
Yeah, I find that with Bonhoeffer, with the little that I have started reading and what I've been studying in the past, that practical theology that you're talking about of how do I apply this now, more than just application, but like thinking it through of what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? And a lot of the things that he is focusing on to make practical of, living at wartime, pursuing peace, being a disciple of Jesus, living in community is one of his big things that he comes back to a lot. These are all these are all topics that are very popular and are very important to millennials and Gen Z right now. The millennials and Gen Z, they're the ones who are really pushing for that authentic community, living in discipleship with one another. That, I don't know if he was necessarily ahead of his time, but that was for sure a big part of Bonhoeffer's life with the cost of discipleship, or I'm blanking on the title. We are going to talk about Life Together. That's one of his works that we are going to talk about. Just these, and you even brought up like the nationalism aspect, that the Nazi regime kind of mixed nationalism with a little bit of Christianity light and speaking out against the nationalism while still like embracing the fact that he's German, like he doesn't just cut that off completely. So yeah, I think he was focusing in on important subjects that are timeless and are currently, with the current crop of young theologians, myself and included, are very passionate about.
Yeah. I think, and he could have had a very cushy academic job at Union Seminary in New York, right? He came over and he could have stayed here and lived out his life writing and speaking to things and thinking through stuff and writing books. But he's like, nope, I'm going back to my homeland to resist and to make a difference there in the midst of it. He had another chance to come back over to the States, and he went to New York and didn't stay very long and went back home and said, nope, this is what I'm doing. He had a pastor. He pastored a congregation in London at a German speaking congregation there at one point, but then came back to Germany. So he had opportunities that he could have said like, nope, I'm gonna be safe here and have a family and live out my life and faith this way, but decided to hop back in and live his life too. And I, speaking, as a Lutheran pastor, I knew of him growing up in the church. His name was thrown around a little bit, but didn't, I was kind of a clueless kid, kind of a surfer kid that didn't pay attention to much until really college and then seminary. And then while I was at seminary, one of the first things they had us read was Life Together. And to be honest, like I read it and it was important and I knew about him, but I don't know how much stuck, just because I was so nervous about seminary in general. What am I going to make in Greek? When am I preaching? Leading worship?
Sure.
I had to get up in front of people, like what kind of grades am I? What church am I going to be assigned to in my contextual education or intro? All those things were revolving around my head. So I didn't quite pay as close attention, or I had to sink in, but it was later digging more into his work, understanding like his work when it comes to Lutherans are all about grace. And this kind of
Mhm.
timeless Reformation question of like, what shape does our faith take in the world, and justified by grace through faith. But then he wrote, there's a difference between cheap grace and costly
Yeah.
grace. Paul wrote to that as well. Luther wrote to that as well, and then Bonhoeffer lifted up as well too. This idea of costly grace and that discipleship, faith in action. It's not just a
Mhm.
passive thing, an academic thing. What does that look like in action? So that's what stands across time. And I also shared that, as a Lutheran pastor, I just this past spring went to
Mhm.
Germany with our campus ministry students to do a tour of these spots, historic spots where Martin Luther
Mm.
lived and died and did his work. And so our campus pastor every few years takes a group of students over there and has done that tour. And this is the first time I was able to go over there. So I went to Wittenberg, I went to Wartburg, I
Mm.
went to these places where Luther lived and breathed and did his work. And while we're over there, Germany acknowledges some of the harmful words that Luther said about Jews, his
Mm.
anti-Semitism.
Mhm.
And even my own denomination, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, has come out and repented from that and asked for forgiveness for those words. And even some of our students were like, what do we do with Luther, in this kind of cancel culture? Like, all
Mhm.
right, what do we do with Luther, who we acknowledge what he did in terms of church history and the importance he is to the
Mhm.
Reformation and how we understand being a Christian? But he said these awful things. So how do we handle Luther? Do we just cancel him outright? Take some of them,
Mhm.
just acknowledge that he got older and cantankerous and had bowel problems and all those things,
Mhm.
and said,
Yeah, yeah.
was that his ulcer speaking? And you're like, well, whatever. It's inexcusable. So
Mhm.
even Hitler and the Nazis were able to use Luther's words to justify what they did in
Mhm.
terms of the Holocaust. But while we were over there in Germany and we were talking about these things, I was like, hey, students, let me also lift up somebody who is also one of our own, who resisted the Nazis, who resisted Hitler, who resisted anti-Semitism, who saw the
Mhm.
injustice, and he's one of our own. He not only did this arise out of what you could say some of Lutheranism itself that we're not very proud of, but it also produced Bonhoeffer as a
Mhm.
hero, as a resistance against that, and a martyr. So we kind of held those in tension with each other. And some
Mhm.
of our students had never heard of Bonhoeffer, and we're able to lift up and say,
Mm.
hey, here's someone you really need to study when it comes to how to handle these big issues, because it is prevalent, right? Christian
Yeah.
nationalism is on the rise. A
Mhm.
lot of comparisons with make America great again, and then Hitler saying let's make Germany great again. All those things
Mhm.
coming around, not necessarily repeating, but definitely have some rhyming going on, and we need
Yeah.
to be aware of that. So we were able to talk about those subjects with our students and lift that up.
There's even been I've seen reports of hashtags of like anti-Semitism, like
Mm-hmm.
hashtags that are skyrocketing. Like last
Mm-hmm.
year, it was one of the most tweeted things was this specific anti-Semitic hashtag. And yeah, there's I've read one thing, which is going to be for next week's episode already, and
Mm-hmm.
there's just so much parallelism. Not one for one specifically, but just so much parallelism
Mm-hmm.
between where Bonhoeffer was at. The thing I was reading, I'm going to talk about next week, comes in the 1930s when he was here in New York for
Right.
his little visit to Union Seminary, and just seeing these parallels between Christian nationalism and the
Mm-hmm.
nationalism of Germany, talking about, even these similar situations to Ukraine and Russia
Mm-hmm.
relations that we have now with the war going on over there. It's interesting how cyclical history can be. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you brought this up, though. I was curious. Every denomination has their heroes, obviously with you guys, your namesake, Martin Luther, or even like for me growing up in the Baptist church, everyone has like this general idea who Charles Spurgeon is, kind of one of
Right.
the biggest uh, claims to fame that the Baptist church has with Spurgeon. So I was curious if this is kind of like with you guys, if Bonhoeffer is like this other pillar, if you have your Mount Rushmore of Lutherans, if it's Luther and Bonhoeffer and two other people that I have no idea who they would be. But but it sounds
Right.
like it's a little bit of this, like, definitely important in seminary, but maybe not as common knowledge to know who Dietrich Bonhoeffer is, even in the Lutheran Church. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're part of systematic ecology, so
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of like in geek terms. Like, there's the people who know the Star Wars movies, but then there are those who like know the extra shows on Disney Plus and the canon and the
Sure.
novels and the how
Yeah,
deep you're
yeah,
going to
yeah.
go in your nerdom. Same with Lutheran theology. I
Okay.
like the general laity knows who Luther is and probably heard of Bonhoeffer, but it's the theology nerds, the Lutheran nerds who
Gotcha.
really get into it, who dive deeper into those things. So they might have heard the name of those kind, or just in kind of world history under him. But in terms of like
Mm-hmm.
read the original words that he wrote from prison, or Life Together, or Cost of
Mm-hmm.
Discipleship, those kinds of works, and we talk about them a little bit in confirmation and youth group, and lift them
Okay.
up with our campus ministry. But again, like teenage will and college will, there's only so much the brain can soak up, or what you're
Oh,
worried
yeah.
about and what you retain. But you hopefully introduce some of these themes and topics and who this man is and why he was so important, especially with attention on the line in terms of what Luther said and some of the
Mm-hmm.
things Luther did towards the end of his life, and then saying, but also part of our heritage is this guy who stood up to fascism, who resisted, and then that brought up. We talked about his life similar to Luther. Luther, took a pilgrimage to Rome, had some disillusionment, had
Mm-hmm.
was and then had an awakening moment. He woke up and tried to wake up others to what was going on around him. And same with Bonhoeffer. Like when he came to Union and met his friend who was African American, who saw with his own eyes what was going on in Harlem and injustice
Mm-hmm.
with people of color, and then meeting his friend from France who had kind of a pacifist understanding, and had debates about war and just war and violence. And so those visits and pilgrimages and relationships is what broadened him to see the world in a deeper way, that he wanted to take church and how we do church and how we do faith on
Mm-hmm.
another level, in a deeper way as well.
I think it's really beautiful too. You talked about this earlier with this coming of full circle of like these problematic things that Martin Luther did say there
Mm-hmm.
towards the end of his ministry life, which we'll talk about him, I'm sure. But Eric Metaxas, in his biography on Martin Luther, very good biography, but does kind of like
Mm.
he's bending him backwards to try and make that
Glossing
section
over a
work.
little
But
bit. Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
just but problematic nonetheless. But you have this beautiful, like, centuries or hundreds of years later of then here's another guy of the same camp in a situation that is partially the result of what Luther said,
Yeah.
and is able to rise up and defend the true gospel still in the process, but also actively work against the power
Mm-hmm.
machine of the Nazis in Germany during that time. It's a beautiful story, I think, particularly
Yeah.
for Lutherans in Germany, of just these two pillars being able to complement each other in the long term, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
So you said that, high school, college will was kind of the first exposure, maybe didn't like retain the information as well because Greek and Hebrew and all the other pressures that poor
Fear of
seminaries,
preaching.
fear
Yeah.
of preaching, how to spend money, all those important things.
Right.
uh, I think that was the same for me, was right around college. When I was in college is when Eric Metaxas's biography on Bonhoeffer came out, and he actually spoke on campus shortly after he did the National Prayer Breakfast. He recycled the speech and did the speech again for us for
Right.
one of our chapel services. But it was actually, I didn't read it. I didn't read that book because you read so much stuff when you're in
Right.
college and seminary. I don't have time to read. That is a thick book. I don't have time. So I read that like later on. I think it was a summer read for me for fun. Um, but my first like real exposure to Bonhoeffer's teachings was in the weirdest of ways. I was in a doctrines class, and everybody had to do a group presentation on a doctrine that you don't believe. And so for kicks and giggles, I signed up, and one of my friends signed up for God is Dead theology. And apparently God is Dead theology is partially inspired by two things that are completely ripped out of context. First is Friedrich Nietzsche talking about God is dead. We live in a society where God is dead. Society has killed God. And then also Bonhoeffer talking about living in a society without God, which comes completely ripped out of context from his prison letters, I
Right.
believe. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was my first exposure. And it was so like, who is this guy?
Nice.
You know?
Nice. Yeah.
And
Good question.
that inspired me to dig deeper. And much like my love for C.S. Lewis, a lot of my love for Bonhoeffer comes from the way that he writes. If I could write like him, I don't know how he was as a preacher. I've never heard him, nor would I mean, it's going to be speaking German, so I don't know if I would really be able to follow anyway. But the way that he writes is it's very inspiring, and it's very thoughtful as well,
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Yeah, and he, writing from prison, and in
Mm-hmm.
another book, or share a little bit, Dr. Pugh's Religionless Christianity, and you talked
Mm-hmm.
about like he's wrestling with the institute, and again, we can relate to with Gen Z and
Mm-hmm.
our own culture is like the disillusionment with organized religion and a
Mm-hmm.
church that claims Christ but not living as Christ in the world, and these kind of dual system, or like, all right, you claim Christ, but yet how are you acting in the world? And it doesn't look a lot like what Jesus taught or did or lived or died or rose again. It doesn't look like
Mm-hmm.
him. So how do you justify the between? So he's looking at it as this kind of disillusionment and deconstruction of like, hey, um, here's what the church should be, and that's selling out
Mm-hmm.
to the lust of power and being in control or bowing down to Nazism and nationalism and selling out. And so, yeah, how do I separate that from the actual words of Jesus himself? So you have Jesus without religion or the
Mm-hmm.
institution of it. And so those kind of things are I think, prevalent and relevant to our own conversation in terms of what the church looks like or should do in
Yeah,
a
for
post-COVID,
sure.
post-Trumpism punch, Christian nationalism has a rise. What does the church look like? All those things, no matter how you vote, it definitely raises the question of what does it mean to follow Jesus and what should the church be doing or not doing. And again, like Metaxas is a term of his book on Bonhoeffer. Dr. Pugh will also share that in his book that Bonhoeffer is kind of like a Rorschach test, that you kind of get
Mm.
out what you want out of him. You can kind of use him to justify for whatever you want or need when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to, like, if you want to take up violence because you feel justified in that again, or well, Bonhoeffer did. He had an assassination attempt on Hitler, so I'm gonna stand up for right and do the same. And so that those kinds of things, I think is relevant when it comes to having a conversation around Bonhoeffer.
So let's talk about those two books,
Yeah.
the two biographies, or at least I know the Metaxas one is a biography. Um, I did not know until probably within the past year that there are some people who don't like that book. Now, for
Right.
me, this was actually a big turning point for me in my theology, was reading this biography and just at least getting exposed to the life of Bonhoeffer. I don't think I would be at where I am now without having read this biography. But apparently, there are some issues. Do you know what these issues are and would like to elaborate? Because I know you said you would rather endorse Dr. Pugh's book. So let's hear
Yeah,
what you
yeah,
have to say.
yeah, Dr. Jeffrey Pugh, who taught at Elon College, not far from Chapel Hill,
Mm,
wrote his book in 2008, 2009. So it's
okay.
before Trump was elected. But I think his problem and his critique, and I didn't read Metaxas' book. All I know
Okay.
is that, like, you have this book about a biography of Bonhoeffer resisting nationalism and kind of the
Mm-hmm.
lust or quest for power, and then and talking about that resistance, and as soon as your side of the political party rises to power, but then and Metaxas being a Trump supporter and being like, oh, cool, yeah, we don't need to resist anymore. We're now in power, so now we have to align ourselves with empire rather than resist against it. So I think that those are the critiques against it. It's like, you talk a big game, but now that we're in power, I'm now justified in being bedfellows with those in power.
Gotcha.
and glossing over that. So it's kind of hypocritical, a take. And I think Dr. Pugh will come out and say that it's just a wrong take. He just has a wrong take on Bonhoeffer. And then, Dr. Pugh talks about his life, but the name of the book is Religionless Christianity, Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Troubled Times. And so I do recommend that book and his work. And a friend of mine, Trip Fuller, does, he's been on systematic ecology, and his homebrew Christianity class is doing a whole like online class workshop series on Bonhoeffer with him and Dr. Pugh leading that with other scholars.
Okay.
And so it's an online class you can sign up for, and they definitely have had lectures, and they speak to some of that too. And of course, they're on the left of things, whereas Metaxas is on the right. So again, this Bonhoeffer is kind of a lightning rod where both sides can say, I claim him as my own.
Yeah.
and they both find ways to do that. But there's not too many historical figures that that's free from that. Like any historical figure, you can kind of look at through a certain lens and say, claim them as your own, But yeah, that's kind of the gist of it for now, without knowing all the intricate detail.
Sure. Yeah, it is funny. You do have these certain theologians that like everybody loves. Everybody loves C.S. Lewis and completely forgets the part that he's Anglican. Like he's the other category, but everybody, it's very few people who actually don't like Lewis. But yeah, you have, I also have this understanding that I even picked up on it when I read Metaxas's biography is although there's a lot of nationalism and like you said, this whole like fighting against the quest for power type of narrative in Bonhoeffer's life, Metaxas draws a lot of comparisons to like the fight in America against abortion. And even as like a young 20-year-old reading this book, I'm like, how is this connecting? I'm not seeing how these are relating. But okay, I will have to add Religionless Christianity by Dr. Pugh to my never-ending list of books to read. You mentioned it earlier, us being a part of systematic geekology. Pastor Will, are there any comic books on the life of Bonhoeffer?
A graphic novel?
Maybe a graphic novel, you would say?
Yeah. Let's talk. I'm going to show it to the people at home in case they're watching.
There we go.
It's called The Faithful Spy, a true story, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Plot to Kill Hitler by John Hendricks. And so it doesn't go too deep into Bonhoeffer's theology as much as kind of the historical rise of Hitler's rise to power and Bonhoeffer's life and response to that. So it definitely leans hard into what's going on in post World War I, the Great Depression, and then the World War II and Hitler's rise to power, and then what Bonhoeffer did with that. It does talk about his theology, son, but it's mainly like this resistance and him being a spy and a quest to assassinate him. And his life is kind of doing an alternative rebel seminary and the confessing church versus like the state Lutheran church of the day that was kind of in bed with Hitler and didn't resist at all, and kind of the arm of that. So, it's really good. It's and I'll share, it's not just graphic novel in terms of pictures, boom pow, and like word bubbles. There's a lot of text in here with pictures and graphics to help lead you into the story. And I found it very helpful, very neat, very sad. By the time I got to the end, to when literally Bonhoeffer was hung, they don't have a picture of him being hung, but they lived that part of that reality in 1945 before he even reached 40 years old. He was killed and executed by the state and hung months before the war ended and Hitler killed himself. And so he was like, man, he almost made it. He was almost liberated. He almost was able to see the end of this regime, but didn't quite get there. So we got to the end. I got kind of emotional there then as you read this story and his life and what he sought to do and resist against, and then him literally being a martyr, executed by the state. pretty moving. So it's a
Mm.
fantastic book when it comes from that angle and more the politics and what was going on.
I'm going to say something real nerdy. I really like that cover. That is some
Oh,
good
it's so
art
good.
on that
It
cover.
is so good, and
That
there's
is
some
good.
there's some really moving, so you just have like a picture of Bonhoeffer and like his life, and kind of you
Mm,
read around it and see
that's
some things,
cool.
but then like Hitler, who saw himself as a wolf, the leader,
Yeah.
and then the text
Okay.
beside it talking about that. So yeah, it is a graphic novel. Use
Hmm.
graphics to show that, and so yeah, and it brings up the book, in terms of. I think Bonhoeffer, what he wanted to ask the question is like, all right, who's your leader? Who is
Mm,
your God? Are you following Hitler? Or are you following God?
yeah.
What's the idol that you're chasing? And I think the very much a conversation in terms of how we do church and politics in our
Hmm.
present day age too, which is why it's a timeless question, a timeless figure to study,
Yeah.
and important now more than ever to dive into and look and explore. So great that you're doing that this summer.
Yeah. And, you got me thinking a little bit here. Something I had never considered before. So he was 40 or just shy of being 40 when
Yeah.
he is killed. And like you said, just several months later, it's all over. The war's over. He almost made it. And it's really
Yeah.
interesting to think about, although he wrote a lot, he preached a lot, he taught a lot. It's really, we only have like a very specific young man, really,
Yeah.
even just
100%.
to his 40s, just a young man. And he would be, he would probably not still be alive today if
Right.
he would have made it. But it's kind of like looking at, okay, here's an example that maybe not everybody will picture, but like Nirvana, Kurt Cobain passing
Mhm.
away so young. The band is like in a very specific time frame and in a very
Right.
specific, like, they did not age. They are forever those 3 albums. We don't get to know what it would have been like nowadays. And it's interesting to think about, like, if Bonhoeffer would have lived, would have made it, like, what would have the next 10, 20, 30, even 40 more years of theology and writing, what that
Yeah.
would have looked like, how that could have shifted Christianity globally. I don't, because that takes you
Yeah.
all the way to the 80s. But, if he lived
Yeah.
another
What would have
40
been his
years,
response to
yeah.
like the Vietnam War or the
Oh, for
Cold
sure.
War to Reagan in power, communism, the Eastern Bloc, in terms of Germany split, the Berlin Wall,
Hmm.
having commentary on that, how he would have spoken for, against, or in light of those things, and shed his wisdom, and how he would evolve. Because I know, man, I think different than when I was
Oh, yeah.
in my 30s, or
Oh,
or
yeah.
or coming out of seminary. I'm a 50-year-old guy, and I've evolved. There's still will. There's still will. There's continuity there. I'm still the same person I was, but
Hmm.
in terms of how I've evolved and grown in my life, yeah, it'd be interesting to see how he would have progressed or grew in terms of his on the world stage of theology.
Yes. Yeah, his commentary, the idea of him having thoughts on Vietnam, that's really interesting to me. As we start to wrap this episode up, do you have any other quick recommendations? We've tossed a lot of books around. Is there any other sitting there that you want to highlight real quick before we get out of here?
Yeah, I think there are books about the person, but I do think reading his own words is important. Life Together
Hmm.
is a short book about
Yeah.
community. Cost of Discipleship a little bit longer, but it definitely leans into that kind of understanding of what is the difference between cheap grace and costly grace.
Hmm.
And then he wrote a book called Ethics, and then his letters from prison, I think, are really important too. So I think reading his own words alongside
Hmm.
a good biography, or people putting him in light of world history then and now, reading his own words, I think is important.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about Life Together in July, I think is the plan as of right now. We're going to talk about
Nice.
that in its completion in July. So I wanted to do the cost of discipleship, but it is a longer one. So if
It
we
is
do this
longer.
again, if we do this series again in the future, maybe I'll start it early so that way actually
Yeah.
have time to get to it. And maybe I'll read a graphic novel too along the way.
There you go. Yes, the graphic novel's a pretty good, easy read. And I think, man, maybe I'll reread Life Together in light of your
Yeah.
in July. And then I
Yeah.
can reminisce about seminary, reading that seminary, but then also probably looking at it through a different lens now, 20 some years later.
Sure.
That would be good.
For sure. All right. Well, thank you, Pastor Will, for helping
Yeah,
us
glad I
get
could.
this conversation started a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And thank you all for listening to today's episode. Remember, if you ever need to find links for anything important, you can go into the description of this episode, find links to the MSL website and shop. Follow the show on Facebook and Instagram. You can always reach out at email seminarylife@gmail.com. Pastor Will and I are both associated with Systematic Geekology, where the priests of the geeks talk about comic books, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Marvel, anime. If it's out there, there's probably an episode on it. Pastor Will and and TJ are all very eagerly awaiting Dune Part 2 later this year to watch and talk about it. It's going to be good. And you can find this show and Systematic Geekology over on the Anazao Ministries podcast network, alongside several other great shows as well. Hey, we got a really heavy season coming up ahead here on the show, because next week we're going to be talking about a lecture Bonhoeffer gave about how World War I and the Treaty of Versailles really tore up the German people, really tore up Germany, and how him pleading for sympathy towards the Germans. So with all of this in mind, if you need something light to listen to, just last week on the show for the Schools Out special, my brother Bradley and I discussed one of our favorite childhood movies. We would watch it every summer to kick off the year, or kick off the summertime. School's out. We would watch Recess, School's Out. So it's just a fun time of me and him
Nice.
talking about this movie. We don't try to shove Jesus into it, because that would be rude to try and do. So yeah, if you need a little bit of a lighter, enjoyable thing before we get into all the heaviness, go check out that episode as well.
Nice.
Thank you again, Pastor Will, for being here.
Yeah, glad to be here. Do good work. Proud of you, Brandon. Proud of you.
Thank you. Thank you. And it was I am continuously so thankful for all the hospitality that you gave us during the convention, letting me sleep rent free for a few nights, taking me out. It was great. Thank you for listening. And remember, this is Brandon signing off, reminding you, as always, that theology is for everyone. So keep on studying.